Have you ever tried to share an insight with your teenager only to be met with fierce resistance? It's as if their brain has an invisible force field around it, deflecting any ideas that come from their parents. In this video, we're going to reveal one of the hidden mechanisms behind this resistance, which I call the fragile ego. We'll dive into the science behind what it is, how it works, and why it is especially potent during the teenage years. And most importantly, we'll look at how to navigate this tricky terrain and land your points with your teenager. The fragile ego is a psychological defense mechanism. Its job is to protect us from any information that might feel threatening or might make us feel bad about ourselves. When we encounter any idea that challenges our identity, our competence, or our sense of self worth, the fragile ego springs into action. It starts poking holes in the argument and finding any reason possible to discredit it. We might start to misremember key details or focus only on the flaws. The crazy thing is, this happens to all of us unconsciously, and we genuinely believe we're being objective. No, this information really just is bogus. It doesn't make sense. It's wrong. The person doesn't know what they're talking about. What's actually happening is our fragile ego is jumping to the rescue to discredit the information so we can protect ourselves from feeling any sense that we might need to change. And especially important for our purposes, the fragile ego is very, very strong during the teenage years. And that has to do with teenage identity formation. Teenagers are trying to form a coherent sense of self. It's one of the major developmental milestones of adolescence. But the process of actually doing this is riddled with insecurity and self-doubt. As teenagers are trying out different roles and identities, they are hypersensitive to anything that threatens their emerging self-concept. The research of psychologist David Elkind adds another level to this. Elkind found that teenagers tend to believe that they're the center of everybody else's attention, as if they are performing their life on an imaginary stage and everyone is scrutinizing them. This heightened level of self-consciousness that they feel can make even minor critiques feel like major threats. Another factor that makes the fragile ego especially powerful during adolescence has to do with the neurological changes that are happening at this time. The teenage brain is undergoing a massive restructuring process. There's really interesting research by neuroscientist Sarah-Jayne Blakemore that really breaks down these changes. Essentially, what's happening is the amygdala, the emotional processing center of the brain, is one of the first parts to really start developing during adolescence. But the prefrontal cortex, where lots of logic and self-control happens, doesn't fully mature until later in your mid-20s. So teenagers are in this neurological phase where they have these strong emotional reactions to things, but they don't necessarily have the logical self-control centers to calm themselves down and put things into perspective. This combination of factors makes teenagers especially likely to interpret any little thing as a personal attack. Okay, so now that we've looked at the fragile ego and we've seen how it applies to teenagers, let's look at how it can derail communication. Maybe you notice that your teenager hasn't been turning in all their homework on time. So you gently try to ask if everything's okay, and they explode at you. You're always on my case. You think I'm a failure. Whoa, what's happening here? Your concern might come from a genuine, nice place, but to your teenager, in order to accept that concern, they would also have to accept these ideas that maybe they're not doing as well as they should be. They're not as competent as they should be. They're not living up to their responsibilities. They're maybe lazy. All of these things that are identities that they don't want to take on come along with your suggestion that maybe something's not going well with their homework. Their fragile ego has interpreted your concern as a threat to their identity. You're saying, I'm not good enough. So they're going to react by shutting down, getting defensive, saying, no, that's not true. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm fine. I don't need help. That's a natural response to protect their sense of competence and self-worth. So how can we share some insights or some concern with a teenager whose fragile ego is going haywire like this? I have a few suggestions. I'm going to walk through them one at a time. The first comes from the research on affirmation. Research by psychologist Jeffrey Cohen offers some ideas on how we can give our teenager feedback without making them defensive. Cohen found that if we affirm someone's core values before we give them critical feedback, that actually makes them a lot more receptive to change. So before you dive into a potentially threatening topic, take a few seconds to affirm some of the positive qualities of your teenager. I've noticed how dedicated you've been to your soccer training lately. That kind of commitment is really impressive. By bolstering their identity a little bit before you present some challenging information, you can help them hear you without getting defensive. Another research backed way to break down some of those defensive barriers with our teenager comes from vulnerability. Teenagers learn by watching us. When we admit our own mistakes and imperfections, we give them permission to do the same. If we're presenting this perfect facade to our kids and we're always giving them feedback on what they're doing wrong, think about how that can feel to them. Wow, I guess dad's good at everything and I'm not. That's a hit to their ego. So they're going to reject that. They're going to get defensive. They're going to say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. That feedback is bogus. Try saying something like, the other day I snapped at my boss because she gave me feedback, and it's hard to receive critical feedback sometimes, even when it's accurate. Later on, I realized that my defensiveness was probably happening because I feel insecure about my work. By modeling that we can accept feedback without meaning that we're a bad person, we can also give our teen permission to accept feedback from us. Okay, so those are two strategies: affirmation and vulnerability. And here's another research backed approach to breaking down those defensive barriers from your teenager. It has to do with perspective taking. Research by psychologist Mark Davis has shown that taking others' perspectives can increase empathy, reduce defensiveness, and improve communication. When your teenager is stuck in a defensive mindset, try saying something like, I know your teacher gave you a lower grade than you were expecting. How do you think they might have been feeling when they were grading your project? Or, I understand you're upset with your friend right now. Can you imagine what might be going on in their life to make them act this way? By guiding your teen to consider other viewpoints, you can help them step outside of their own ego and break down some of that defensiveness. So, we've seen what the fragile ego is, why it's so powerful in teenagers, how it can derail communication, and we've looked at three strategies for how we can break down those defensive barriers: affirmation, vulnerability, and perspective taking. Hopefully you find these helpful. Give it a try. Let me know how it goes in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to our channel for more research-backed insights on how to communicate more effectively with your teenager. I'll see you in the next video.